Shoink. Impressive. As many of you know, I am a huge proponent of weighted hyperextensions for building big, strong hamstrings. I made a video talking about this exercise a few years ago, and I've made a couple more videos talking about it in recent history as well, smaller pieces. But with that, I often get asked about Nordic curls for hamstring training and how the hyperextension compares to Nordic curls specifically, especially in recent history, with the knees over toes guy popularizing the Nordic curl exercise more so than it ever has been previous. It seems that a lot of people are under the misconception that Nordic curls and Nordic curls alone are sufficient to work the hamstring muscles in their entirety, and this is simply not the case. The reason for this is due to the anatomy of the human body, the anatomy of the hamstring muscles, and the nature of the Nordic curl exercise. The hamstrings, those big chunks of meat on the back of your thighs, are actually comprised of 3 separate muscles, and they're what's known as a biarticular muscle group. That is, they cross over and act upon 2 different joints. In this case, it's both the hips, where they create hip extension. So basically, along with help from the glutes, that is punching the hips from a flexed position into a straightened position. That is hip extension. And then they also act on the knees, where they create knee flexion, which is basically pulling the back of the ankle up towards the back of the thigh. Now, the nature of the Nordic curl exercise is dynamic knee flexion along with a corresponding static extension of the hips. That is, the hips are held in an extended position during the movement, but they do not actually flex or extend in a dynamic fashion. The dynamic movement takes place at the knee joints, where the hamstrings create knee flexion concentrically and resist knee extension eccentrically. But knowing what we know now, that the hamstrings are biarticular and act upon both the knees and the hips, it should be pretty clear at this point that any exercise that neglects this function of dynamic hip extension is not working the hamstrings to their full capacity, right? And while both functions here of the hammies are incredibly important, personally, I would argue that the hip extension function of the hamstrings should be the primary concern for most trainees, and the knee flexion function should actually be the secondary concern for most trainees. So to relegate the act of hip extension to secondary status, or to train it in solely a static and nearly unloaded fashion, as in the Nordic curl and the Nordic curl alone, is to leave a gaping hole, both in terms of potential athletic performance as well as muscle and strength gains. So this is where hinging exercises come into play, and here I'm not really talking about deadlifts of any variety done from the floor either, but rather pure hinging movements that both utilize an eccentric phase and deliberately attempt to hone in on hip flexion and extension to as great of a degree as possible. So here, the primary movements would be variations of Romanian deadlifts, good mornings, and of course my personal favorite, the weighted hyperextension. All of these exercises really, actually, side note, the hyperextension, the weighted hyper, in my opinion, is the best hinge exercise of all. Talk about that in another video. But anyway, all these exercises really attempt to accomplish the same thing, right? That is, they force you to master the act of hinging about the hips, lengthening the glutes and hamstrings under load while maintaining a strong brace through the erector muscles in the back, right? And this loaded eccentric phase, where the hamstrings are continually encouraged to own greater and greater ranges of motion under heavy loading as a precursor to a powerful extension of the hips as you move back into a fully erect position, is probably the best way, the absolute best way to build size and strength in the hamstrings, while also ensuring optimal mobility levels throughout the posterior chain. As well, the entire act of proper weight training really is contingent upon having adequate hip control. So becoming a master of the hinge, i.e. learning how to move about the hips properly, is going to go a very long way towards making you a master of the weight room, and is also going to serve you very well when you're dealing with heavy objects in real life. So to summarize, yes, there are some very major differences between the Nordic curl and the hyperextension, as well as all the other pure hinge type movements. And one category here cannot substitute for the other category because each one works a different function of the hamstrings. Therefore, if you skip out on one or the other, then you are leaving gains on the table, point blank. Now, I'm of the opinion that there should always be some form of hinging as well as some form of knee flexion movement in the training program pretty much all year round. In terms of hinges, I like to do a variety of heavy, medium, and light work depending on the exercise that I'm currently focusing on, as some movements just kind of by their nature lend themselves better to higher rep ranges, and then others kind of lend themselves better to lower rep ranges and heavier weights. And then in terms of knee flexion exercises, I always keep some form of leg curling in the program at all times, pretty much at all times, and that can be a unilateral version, a bilateral version, it can be done 2-1 style, or even tempo style. And then when I want to push that work a little bit harder, if that is something that I'm looking to do, or if that's something that one of my trainees is looking to do, then that's when I'll start to introduce things like glute ham raises and Nordic curls, aka natural glute ham raises, into the training program, as those movements are much more intense and they require much greater focus as well as longer recovery times. But not all trainees even need to take that step. If for example, if you don't care about athletics or sprinting or anything like that, you don't really need to do Nordics or glute ham raises. I would say you do absolutely need to do heavy hinge work, but you can probably get away with less intense knee flexion work. So you can probably get all the benefits that you need from knee flexion just from leg curling variations and derivatives of that. Anyway, I hope this video clears up any confusion on this topic, and I hope that it helps you to understand why both categories of exercises here are necessary for comprehensive hamstring training, as well as why one simply cannot substitute for the other. Check out Untitled for online coaching and training programs, and keep training hard. I will catch you guys next time.